Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. We're going back to the topic of poetry today, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different. This is a video that I suggested I might make a while ago, and we're finally doing it. Back when I was 17, I wrote my English literature coursework for A-level English Lit, and I did what I thought was impossible and got full marks on this essay. And I went on and got full marks in the exam as well, and ended up winning this, literature award in my school for literary criticism, basically. And I was very, very proud of this essay. It was about feminism and sexuality and desire in literature. And I thought, now it's over 10 years later, God, I feel really old, I thought I would go back, reread this essay and kind of pick it apart a little bit and discuss it and talk about some of the good points I made, some of the bad points I made, and just kind of where I would change it today and what I would do different if I was analysing these texts now. In preparation for this video, I have not read this essay because I wanted this to be like a sort of first reaction in 10 years on camera kind of thing. But I do have some thoughts I want to share before we get reading it, but I figured the first thing I'd do is tell you my essay title. So I used a quote from Mary Evans and her book Introducing Contemporary Feminist Thought, which was written in 1997. And her quote was, or rather her statement was, "For some feminists, any participation in a heterosexual relationship carried with it inevitable exploitation." And from there, that was kind of my jumping off point, and my title was Compare and Contrast the Ways in which the texts Wide Sargasso at Sea by Jean Rhys, The World's Wife by Caroline Duffy, and The Fat Black Woman's Poems by Grace Nichols explore female sexuality and desire, which I still think is a very, very interesting topic, and it's one that I still do a lot of reading around, a lot of research around, and kind of like to discuss here on my channel. One thing I will say is that I did not get the texts that I wanted for this essay. My initial proposal for what I wanted to write for this was actually a comparison of Duffy's text, Nichols's text, but instead of Wide Sargasso at Sea, I wanted The Colour Purple by Alice Walker, because I wanted a more intersectional feminist approach to this essay. I wanted to look at, well, it would have been interesting because Duffy in The World's Wife writes about female sexuality both from a white heterosexual perspective, but she's also a white homosexual woman herself. Grace Nichols writes from a black heterosexual perspective, whereas The Colour Purple covers black heterosexual and homosexual perspectives. Yeah, that was a big mouthful, but the point is, I could have contrasted different races' experiences, different class experiences as well, because again, The Colour Purple is a lot more like working class, and some of the women in Duffy's poetry are a lot more middle and upper class. And I could have also covered the differences between same-sex and different sex couples, and I think it would have been super, super interesting. I really, really, really wish I'd had a chance to explore those themes further. But I had to choose two texts that were being taught by teachers in my school at the time, and The Colour Purple wasn't being taught, so I had to do Wide Sargasso at Sea, which, controversial opinion, I did not enjoy, which is crazy because I love Jane Eyre, which is what it's based on and a prequel to. I gotta cover some of the issues I wanted using this book, but not in the same way that I would have if I could have used The Colour Purple. Oh my god, I think if I'd got to use that book, this essay would have been miles above where it was. But anyway, that is my biggest regret, but I had to work with what I had to work with, and this is what we had. I'm very nervous about reading this, actually. I feel like it's not going to be as good as I remember, and I'm going to pick a lot of faults in it, but, you know, this is important. This is how we learn, this is how we grow. Being highly critical of yourself is how you improve, or at least that's how I improve. I'm probably too critical of myself sometimes, but it works, because I'm constantly trying to get better, right? Okay. Bear in mind, I was 17 when I wrote this, and I'm 28, nearly 29 now, so my perspective has changed a lot. I've learned a lot since this point, but this was kind of my jumping off point, and this was where it all began. Throughout history, women have been viewed as subordinate to men in all areas of society. In the family, religion, and education, women were never shown the same respect, and were always treated as objects or possessions of men. However, all this changed with the development of feminism. The beginning of the 20th century brought the first wave, the emphasis on women's suffrage and attaining the right to vote. Over the next century, feminism changed. With the second and third waves, the focus changed slightly, but the central ideology remained the same. Women craved equality. Feminist messages spread throughout society, and even became more embedded in academic subjects, which is a quote from June Hannam in her book Feminism, published in 2007. I actually have a lot of quotes and references in this, so I will leave my sources list that I had for this essay down in the video description below, so you can go check them out if you want. And you'll notice the footnotes on screen as I'm reading this, so they'll match up to the footnotes in the video description, so you can see where I'm quoting from. An invaluable resource for giving us an insight into the position of women is feminist literature. Typo there. Its portrayal of women's sexuality and society's reaction to it allows us to understand the true extent of women's oppression in a particular society or culture, or in some cases, the lack of it. So far, I kind of think that's a fairly good analysis. I know some people today debate what the waves of feminism were. Some people say what we're in now is the third wave of feminism, but the literature that I read at the time, and still a lot of literature I read today, suggests that third wave was actually kind of closer to being in the 80s, and it was when we started looking at women of different races and classes and understanding how that impacted their treatment as well. And I say their treatment like I'm not a woman myself, but you know what I mean. And then some people say that the kind of early 2000s was a period of post-feminism, whereas now we're getting kind of another wave again, and I don't know if I call this a fourth wave or what. It's hard to say when you're living through it, really. But the point is, regardless of what we call these periods, it's very clear that there are periods of history and different kind of periods of feminism when the focus was on different things, and what we name them is mostly just semantics, so it's not the biggest deal. Interestingly, these three texts were written at three important dates in feminist history. Jean Rhys's novella Wide Saga Sea, written in 1966 during the second wave of feminism, explores female sexuality much in the same way women in the UK were at the time. However, it is also important to note that being set in early 19th century Jamaica, it gives us an idea of what a pre-feminist patriarchal society was like. Similarly, the Fat Black Woman's poems, written and published during the third wave of feminism, also explores female sexuality, but in a far more explicit and light-hearted way, thus echoing the sexual freedom that was becoming a key part of society's norms. Caroline Duffy's collection of poems, The World's Wife, reflects the post-feminist contemporary society written at the very end of the 20th century. It demonstrates the far more liberal and open-minded views that people now hold in relation to women's sexuality. Again, I think that's a fair, if overly simplistic summary, but obviously I had a word count and it's hard to go into the nuances when you only have 3,500 words to play with. I'd also argue that I was right in this from a very UK-centric perspective, and I'd argue that especially in the UK, people are more liberal and open-minded in relation to women's sexuality, but what I've learned over the last decade is in many, many countries this just isn't the case. Even in America, this just isn't the case, and it kind of seems like America is regressing a lot. It also doesn't take into account other cultures and their views on sexuality. So that's not to say this is an invalid perspective, it's just worth understanding it's from a very narrow UK-centric approach, which is an important one to look at, but it's also important to note that it's not the only one. That makes sense? Hope that makes sense. Set in the patriarchal 19th century, when it would be fair to say mainstream social and political thought commonly accepted and confirmed women's subordinate position, Wide Saga Sea's portrayal of a male-dominated relationship seeks to provide an accurate representation of many relationships at the time. Rochester married Antoinette purely for money. To him, she is merely a possession, an object, a way of gaining status among other men and his family. Yet Antoinette does not necessarily see anything wrong with this, or if she does, she dare not speak up about it because as a result of patriarchy, women were forced to accept their lot in life without visible question. Like many other girls, she would have been socialized into feminine values and behavior, which were associated with passivity, submissiveness, and dependence. As a child, other than Christophine, her only female role model was her mother, who was clearly an unhappy woman until she met Mr. Mason, who was only in Jamaica because he came to make money as they all do. The fact that her potential happiness is reliant on her husband reinforces these traditional stereotypes and therefore arguably portrays her as weak and submissive. It also shows Mr. Mason as being typical of men at the time. His primary concern had nothing to do with the well-being of his wife, but instead was to acquire money and wealth for himself. Yeah. I don't really have much to comment on this. Again, Wide Saga Sea wasn't a book that I enjoyed, and it's not one that I'm hugely invested in. I think these are all fair points. It's okay. I do wish I'd done a little more actual literary analysis on this bit, on the phrases like, because I quoted from the book here, I think, where apparently Mr. Mason only came to Jamaica to make money as they all do. I wish I'd done like a little more in-depth literary analysis of that and the kind of casualness of the phrase, like oh, came to make money like they all do. It's quite, the tone is very dismissive, the tone is cynical. It's quite cynical, isn't it? It's like, oh, they're all the same, blah, blah, blah. It would have been quite interesting to look at that in more depth and kind of just look at the generalizations that are made about men in general in this book and the tone that is used throughout to talk about men as a whole. That would have been interesting, but again, word count, and I was trying to set up the argument for the rest of the essay here. Again, also being set in Jamaica, it would have been really, really interesting if I'd gone into more depth about the different issues in races and classes and so on, and covered that in more detail. But again, word count. So, God, there's so much to talk about. It's really hard to like condense it all down to a short essay for something like this when you're 17. Furthermore, male control is not just expressed through money and position in the novella, but through sexual dominance as well. The 1960s and 70s saw the second wave of feminism, which did not simply seek to explain the inequalities between men and women, but used this as a basis for change. During this time, women began to feel more equal to men and were a lot more open about their sexuality. Riis's portrayal of Antoinette, it can be argued, personifies this aspect of the feminist movement. She is obviously an overtly sexual character, and in the 60s, the rules of sexual relationships were being rewritten, which probably influenced Riis to portray Antoinette's sexual desire for Rochester so explicitly. She is unafraid to ask him why he will not fulfill her desires. Why do you never come near me, or kiss me, or talk to me? Why do you think I can bear it? Evans claims that sexual freedom became synonymous with an expectation of personal liberation and the pursuit of individual happiness. However, as Rochester withholds sex from Antoinette, he takes away her freedom, therefore suggesting that she is neither liberated nor happy. Her desire becomes clear when Christophine talks to Rochester and uses the metaphor, she's thirsty for you, suggesting that the feeling is more than something Antoinette merely wants, instead she needs it. The use of the adjective thirsty builds on this argument as it can be interpreted as having sexual connotations, which again, more than connotations, come on, sorry, which again shows the strength of Antoinette's sexual desires, which should empower her as a woman, but instead allow her to be oppressed by her sexist husband. In comparison, both Nichols and Duffy subvert this norm in their poems Invitation and Anne Hathaway, and instead show female sexuality as empowering, and therefore their personas are, unlike Antoinette, strong and independent. This is actually a really, really, really good point, and it's one which is incredibly relevant today, especially in cultures like America. This is a huge thing that I talk about in so many of my videos. This idea of men using female sexuality to shame them and guilt them and inevitably control them. It's a huge pattern you see in so many of these books that I review, and it's not actually just men shaming women for it, it's women as well. The idea of a woman being an independent, sexually free being is terrifying to men. You allow women their sexual freedom and men get scared of it, they're intimidated by it. You don't allow a man to control you sexually and they think, well, what do we have? And they grasp onto anything, and that's why they end up guilting you and shaming you. You see it in all the videos I've done on MGTOW and incels, and basically like any feminist video I've done that mentions female sexuality. There's lots of things that, oh, well, if a woman does this, we don't want her, and oh, where will you be then? It's like, same place we're in now, but better, because we're not being controlled by a man, you know. Sorry, I'm rambling here. The point is, this is actually a really, really interesting point. I feel like this book was way ahead of its time, actually, now looking back. It would have been very, very interesting to compare the way Antoinette is shamed for her kind of owning her sexuality and having sexual desires, and the way she's controlled in that way. It would be interesting to compare that to, it's going to sound ridiculous, but like contemporary forums online in which men talk about women. Like, I would love to see like a comparison of the kinds of words that men use today compared to like Rochester in the book and so on. It'd be interesting. It'd be interesting. I don't know if I'm expressing myself right, but do you know what I mean? And then we have some references to Jane Eyre, which is my favourite book. I love it so much. White Success's protagonist Antoinette was based on the character Bertha in the novel Jane Eyre, and consequently there are similarities between Riis's character and Bronte's. However, Riis's female characters are obviously a lot stronger, more independent and more aware, and in control of their sexuality than Bronte's women. There's some weird punctuation going on here. I'm not quite sure how I was trying to word that, but bit iffy. Anyway, arguably this may be because Risa's writing was influenced by the feminist movement, and so she may have unintentionally embedded some feminist ideology within her writing. This is clear in characters such as Christophine, who lives alone without a husband controlling her, and who is unafraid to voice her own opinions. To take a Freudian approach, controversial me, to take a Freudian approach, it can be argued that Jane Eyre, Bronte's intelligent, if not somewhat naive heroine, is symbolic of the superego, while Antoinette, or Bertha as she is referred to in Jane Eyre, represents the id. In the patriarchal 19th century when Brontë was writing, Jane would have seemed a strong, independent woman, and to some extent she is. However, she is still suppressed sexually by Rochester, and her need to please him constantly gives her the selfless qualities of the superego. Bertha, on the other hand, is clearly dehumanized by Rochester, locked in an attic and the recipient of no love, compassion, or respect from her husband. She is treated no better than an animal. In White Sagacity, Rochester creates an image of Antoinette that is not only unfeminine, but also inhuman. Her hair hung uncombed and dull into her eyes. Her feet were bare. Risa's use of the word hung has the negative connotations of abandonment and suggests she has just given up. The fact she no longer has any interest in her appearance isolates her from other women who stereotypically are thought to take great care of their looks. Furthermore, the imagery of her bare feet may be interpreted as being symbolic of her isolation from humanity, creating imagery of animals, particularly wild animals. It's as though Rochester no longer sees her as domesticated or in fact human. To him, she is almost like a wild animal as he does not understand her. Therefore, a possible interpretation here would be that the id has taken over and she is controlled, or so Rochester believes, purely by her instincts. Interesting that if that's the case, that's why he's shaming her, isn't it? In Jane Eyre, Bertha is living purely for herself, although her very sexual identity has been lost with her claim to humanity. However, it is Risa's Antoinette who truly embodies the id. She is a sexually aware woman who arguably serves as a distorted mirror image to Jane's own dangerous propensities towards passion, Bronte's frequent euphemism for sexuality. Rochester is a portrayal of the typical 19th century man. He's used to being in control and does not understand how to handle his wife's sexual desires. As Lucy O'Brien writes, throughout history, the female body has been objectified as a source of sexual arousal or suggestion. Women were supposed to be the subjects of sexual desires, not have their own. Oh, that's such an important point. I remember actually reading this book. Oh my god, I'm supposed to have a driving lesson. Right, hello, sorry about that. I completely forgot I had a driving lesson booked. I started filming and I've just been off, done my lesson, popped to the shop, deliver some dresses that I sold on Vinted, and now I'm back, like 2 hours later. So, sorry about that. Normally I plan out these things better so I can just film in all one go, but my mind has been all over the place recently. I feel like I was on a roll with whatever I was saying, and now I need to get back into the flow. I'm at that point where, like, I'm too far into the video to just refilm. So we were talking about how men use women's sexuality as like a weapon against them, either to take advantage of them or to shame them for expressing it and owning it. Basically, whatever women do, we can't win. If we own our sexuality and we're independent and free and we like that, then we're sluts and we deserve to be shamed and guilted. But if we don't have sex, then we're prudes and we should be shamed and blah blah blah. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at. So I think I was about to read on with this. So we spoke about this Lucy O'Brien quote. Throughout history, the female body has been objectified as a source of sexual arousal or suggestion. And then I added onto this, women were supposed to be the subjects of sexual desires, not have their own. That was like the crux of everything I wrote about during my time at sixth form in terms of like media and literature, because I did media studies as well. And I'd love to find my essay from that. I did a really interesting one on portrayals of female sexuality in electro music, which was really interesting. Kyra, baby, you're making all the noise. Let me just pause while she eats. Sorry. So I went on to write, as a result, Rochester claims she thirsts for anyone, suggesting he believes that by embracing her sexuality, she has sacrificed her morals. Risa's use of italics gives Rochester a disapproving, almost disgusted tone, as though he believes he, as her husband, is being disrespected. I think this is what I was saying I should have gone into more before, so apparently I did. Good. Moreover, as before, the use of the metaphor thirst suggests it is more than just something she wants, but something she needs. It is instinctual and therefore controlled by the id, of which she is an embodiment. In contrast, Nichols sees female sexuality as a positive thing, something which should be embraced, not looked at with disgust or hidden away. Her writing empowers women, encouraging them to celebrate their sexuality and be proud of it. She suggests that while it may made... Oh, another typo, damn. She suggests that while it may be a biological need, there's no reason it cannot and should not be enjoyed. That's why I love Grace Nichols. We're going to go on here to speak more about Nichols' work in depth in the next few paragraphs, but I think I've spoken about this briefly in videos before, but when I first read a lot of Grace Nichols' poetry, I did not get it. It didn't resonate with me. I didn't understand it. I thought it was overly simplistic and kind of boring. And then I went to a poetry reading and saw her read some of her stuff, and suddenly everything just clicked into place and I got it, and I was like, oh. And it was like a mind-blowing moment where like I finally felt like I understood her voice and her as a person and her as a woman. And she was writing so much about her experience with that, and it was incredible. I think she is such a talented, strong, inspiring woman, and she was one of the first people I ever saw really write quite explicitly about her sexuality and just really take control of it. And that was something that I found very, again, empowering. I'm saying this word a lot, but I find her work very empowering. And it was inspiring, and it opened me up to this like whole new world where women completely took control of their bodies and their sexuality and owned it. And not just in the sense of having sex with whoever you wanted, but also not having sex when you didn't want to. She made me realise that we women have control over that. And yeah, I think understanding Nichols' work was a really like formative part of me becoming who I am today, you know? So I owe her a hell of a lot. She's a wonderful woman. Also just very, very kind and sweet. I met her and she was amazing. I think there's a really blurry photo of me and my English class with her somewhere, so I'll see if I can find it. It was, bearing in mind I was 17 or something at the time. Sorry, baby. Oh, do you want to come up and say hi for the video? Yeah? Hi, gorgeous. Come onto my knee, say hello. That's it. Pop your little head up. Mwah. Hi, beautiful. What do you think? Are you a feminist? Mm-hmm. Snort if you're a feminist. Good girl. You're a strong, independent lady, aren't you? Yeah, you're very inspirational. Yes, you are. Here you go. Here's another example of a strong, independent woman who's had her sexuality controlled by others. Before I adopted her, she was forced into having babies, forced into having puppies. She didn't have a choice in it, she just had to, and then they were taken away from her. And, you know, she might be a dog, but I don't think that's very fair, is it? You didn't get a say in the matter, did you? No, I'm sorry about that. I love you. I'd never make you do that. Love you so much. Never lie down for me while I work. Because these videos had so many interruptions, but you are the most pleasant of them. I love you. Alright, you gonna lie down? Go on then. Good girl. So I went on to say, while Rees explores the concept of female sexuality being oppressed by patriarchy, Nichols takes a different view. Writing 20 years later during the third wave of feminism, Nichols' characters are strong, independent women who embrace and celebrate their sexuality. The third wave of feminism was a result of some women feeling the second wave was, in some ways, unsuccessful. It didn't address the issues that different women experienced sexism differently. It ignored how class and race influenced a woman's experience. Many argued it was, and I quote, too rigid in its definitions and for holding back women from doing whatever they wanted. Consequently, the 1980s challenged society's definition of what it was to be female. Feminists rejected the labels put upon them by the middle-class white women and instead made it something personal to an individual. Arguably, it was this movement that truly empowered women and inspired Grace Nichols' collection, The Fat Black Woman's Poems. I thoroughly stand by everything I said in this. Yeah, I like that little section. I think it's good. I think it's important. I think it highlights a lot of issues that we had with feminism before that point. This is why I'd say today we're more in a period of, like, fourth wave feminism where we're being even more intersexual and we're also considering, you know, trans women's experiences and non-binary people who might have been assigned female at birth and so on. And we're also considering more men's rights issues as well. For example, inequalities in family court towards men. We're considering the absolute lack of care that there's been for men's mental health over the years, and it does feel more inclusive, but again, it's still about kind of opposing the patriarchy and opposing oppression. You just do that in different ways, and by making sure everyone feels included and equal and safe. That includes men, women, non-binary people, everyone. So yeah, we're heading towards a good place in many ways. it's just a shame that some cultures are regressing a lot as well. The interesting thing about Nichols is that as well as just giving women a voice, she specifically gives black women a voice. Nicholson in 1997 writes that many black women have a good understanding of both sexism and racism, but because of everyday constrictions of their lives, cannot risk struggling against them both. However, in this collection, Nichols does just this and opposes both sexism and racism. She is proud she is a woman, and she is proud she is black. Moreover, she is proud of her sexuality. In the poem Invitation Part 2, which to this day is still one of my favourites, in the poem Invitation Part 2, she begins with the repetition of the line, "Come up and see me sometime." The short, sharp imperative, consisting predominantly of monosyllabic words, creates a commanding tone, thus portraying the persona as strong and authoritative, even though she is both black and a woman. So again, I think this is something that I kind of wish I'd pushed and spoken about more, especially if I'd been able to compare it to The Colour Purple. Seeing these strong black women embracing every part of their identity and who they are, I think it would have been something really good to explore in a lot of detail and compare and contrast between the poetry and the novel, and just, you know, because you had very different women in The Colour Purple, and you didn't just have heterosexual relationships, and you also had them covering the issue of rape in a heterosexual relationship and the more kind of loving, sensual, discovering your sexuality in a homosexual relationship. And I feel like to bring all of those aspects together and to compare them and to bring in the issues of race and class as well would have just been so interesting and so illuminating. And I wish I'd been able to do it. I really, really do. It would have been fantastic. It is clear from the beginning that this is a woman who is not afraid to speak her mind. She continues by describing her body in explicit detail, just one example being, "My breasts are huge, exciting amnions of watermelon." The use of the adjective exciting gives her writing a fun tone and shows she isn't taking herself too seriously. However, it also shows her confidence because of how positive she's being. It is clear she loves her body. This is shown further with the use of the metaphor. She uses it to compare her body to a fruit, which suggests she sees it as something very natural and organic. It is something which she accepts for what it is and doesn't try to change. Yeah, absolutely true. And again, if I was writing today, I think I would probably compare this to the way other people have used fruit to discuss sexuality in poetry as well. For example, we've seen in more contemporary poetry, Halsey, I still don't know how to say her name. I keep watching interviews, people say it differently. Anyway, we saw in her poetry book, she used watermelon as a metaphor in a couple of different poems to talk about her sexuality and possibly her pregnancy and miscarriage and so on. And you also have people like Christina Rossetti in her poem Goblin Market, which is one that I've spoken about on this channel before, and again is one of my favourite poems of all time, in which she uses the goblins bringing fruit and sweet things and treats and stuff as a way to kind of like seduce women into essentially giving into their sexual desires, if that makes sense. I explained it far better in the other video where I spoke about it, but the point is, I think it would have made an excellent point of comparison, and also there are probably some points in The Colour Purple where they talk about similar sorts of things, and but that's off the top of my head. I haven't read the book in a few years, and I think it would have made some really interesting talking points. I would have liked to have gone into more detail there. Absolutely. Furthermore, Nichols continues using imagery to describe the female body in her poem Beauty. In this poem, she claims that beauty is a fat black woman walking the fields. Just one example of how throughout the poem she uses declaratives and writes in a confident tone. She is confident in what she is saying, unlike Reese's character Antoinette. She will not allow herself or her opinion to be influenced or changed by men. I was writing with quite a confident tone here as well, wasn't I? I believed in what I was saying. I'm quite proud of past me. This isn't too bad for a 17-year-old. Yeah, I'm impressed by past me. Good one. Go me. This particular poem is split into two stanzas. Both use natural imagery throughout, but both create different imagery and portray the female body, and consequently female sexuality, differently. The first stanza mentions a breezed hibiscus and how the sun lights up her feet. All the imagery is quite light and positive, and there is a somewhat relaxed feel to the poem. It portrays the traditional idea of beauty while juxtaposing images of the persona as both black and fat, neither things being traditionally beautiful. Therefore, this subverts stereotypes and shows Nichols to be a powerful, independent woman, as many women were trying to be in the 80s. I think, again, this would have been a great point to dive in further and look at how there has been some really, really harmful literature out there which does absolutely demonise, like I say, fat black people, or either or both. There have been some really negative works out there, both in literature and poetry, and also just the media, and it would have been nice to see that contrast between these like traditionally negative things and her saying, no, screw that, you're all wrong. It's flipping beautiful. I nearly swore there. God, this is getting me, like, I don't swear. Ooh. You know what I mean? This is, I find her so inspiring. She's wonderful. Sorry. Previously, black women had to struggle with black men against racism, while they also struggled with black men against sexism, and therefore were not in the best position within society. They were essentially bottom of the hierarchy. Therefore, this third wave of feminism gave them power and control they had never experienced before. A little bit of weird wording there from me, but that's okay. Also, this quote I just used here was from Linda Jane Nicholson in 1997, writing The Second Wave, a reader in feminist theory, about black women had to struggle with black men against racism while they also struggle with black men against sexism. I think it would have been interesting to kind of look at this claim in a little more detail and talk about how they weren't just struggling with black men against racism, they were struggling against all people against racism, and then men against sexism, and also, I don't know, I don't quite know how to word this. The point is, I think that's maybe a little overly simplistic, and there's a lot more nuance in that, and I think it glosses over certain struggles that women were facing from more angles than just black men, if that makes sense. Like, yeah, I think I could have been more critical of that statement, and we could have explored it a lot further. Anyway, and therefore were not in the best position within society. They were essentially bottom of the hierarchy. Therefore, this third wave of feminism gave them power and control they had never experienced before. Weird wording, I think there's like a typo in there. Anyway, in comparison, the tone in the second stanza changes slightly. Instead of feeling relaxed, it's a lot more intense, although still very positive. Another typo here, but she describes the feeling of drifting in happy oblivion. This is a lot more focused on and aware of her body, as she says the sea turns black to hug her shape. Although drifting is not an action you would normally associate with something intense, the juxtaposition of this with the noun oblivion suggests she is consumed by this happiness, which is obviously overwhelming, but in a very positive way. Interesting interpretation. Okay. I mean, I kind of agree with it. It doesn't mean there's lines there. I don't know if that's what I would have interpreted it as today, but I like it. It makes sense. Yeah. This suggests she feels free and independent and celebrates her empowerment as a woman. Okay, yeah, no, I like this, yeah. In contrast, Reese's character Antoinette seems to experience feelings of emptiness rather than happy oblivion, possibly a result of oppression. Rochester describes her as having a fixed smile, but her eyes were so withdrawn and lonely. Yeah, God, that's an absolute, like, polar opposite to Nichols, isn't it? Furthermore, Nichols' writing contradicts many of the concepts that were previously believed before feminism, including the idea that women are powerless to change their condition in life. Nichols' black female persona is strong and unafraid to take a stand. In this way, Nichols' fat black woman is very similar to Christophine in Reese's novella. Both go against the norms that would be acceptable in a white middle-class culture. Both are confident and independent. Both command respect, and both are willing to stand up for what they believe. In Nichols' poem The Assertion, she rejects society's expectations in just one simple line by stating that the fat black woman refuses to move. Oh, that's such a powerful moment. Love that. This shows that while women were once victimized by sexist oppression, Nichols, like many women at the time, was prepared to use her writing to make a stand. No longer did she want to abide by men's rule, like the persona in her poems. She simply refuses to be controlled anymore. Ah. What a wonderful woman. Writing years after Reese and Nichols, Carol Duffy. Missed out on Anne. Ooh. God, what am I doing? More typos. Writing years after Reese and Nichols, Carol Ann Duffy is arguably one of the most famous and influential feminist poets of the late 20th and 21st century. In a similar way to Nichols, her poems portray strong, powerful women who embrace and celebrate their sexuality and are not afraid to fulfill their desires. First published in 1999, her poetry collection The World's Wife reflects the post-feminist contemporary society. It demonstrates more liberal and open-minded attitudes of people today, particularly in reference to women's sexuality. This particular collection focused primarily on telling the stories of both real and fictional men throughout history from a female perspective, thus empowering women, bringing them out of the background and giving them a voice. Yeah, so this is something that I kind of wish I'd focused on a little bit more, this idea of bringing women out of the background, because that's also what was happening in Wides Like SSC. Bertha in Jane Eyre is a background character. Even though she does have actions like, spoilers, setting the house on fire and so on, she is quite passive. She's still very controlled. And in White Like Us Sea, Rhys did give her a voice. She brought her out of the background, and she brought in these other characters as well, like Christophine, and brought them out of the background and into the foreground and made women the focus. And I kind of wish I'd maybe spoken a little bit more about the obvious, like, comparative themes there between Duffy's The World's Wife and Rhys's White Like Us Sea, you know? An example of this is Anne Hathaway, which is a poem we've spoken about many times on this channel because, again, it's one of my favourites. Unlike Rhys and Nichols, it neither promotes independence or dependence. Instead, it focuses on equality of the sexes. Written from the perspective of Shakespeare's wife after his death, his lover reflects on their relationship. Clearly, her memories are fond ones, and the tone is positive and happy. The thing to note about their relationship, from the way Duffy writes it, is that they were equal. They were partners. Before feminism, it was believed that, like the rest of society, sexual relationships followed a similar pattern of dominance and submission. However, Duffy's characters are neither dominant. Oh my god. Again, typos. Oh my god. However, Duffy's characters are neither dominant nor submissive. Instead, to them, sex is about sharing and being together. There's something beautiful about Duffy's language that makes their relationship seem ideal, and therefore out of place in Shakespearean times when relationships would have been patriarchal and focused primarily on the man's needs and desires, and yet it makes it relevant to today's culture where men and women are a lot more equal. In Duffy's poem, Anne Hathaway is a woman who obviously understands her desires and her sexuality. Again, this was another poem which kind of opened my eyes to the way that, like, women can enjoy sex too. It's not just a thing for the man. Seeing this woman kind of take control and love what she's doing and love her partner and really, like, enjoy sex was, again, eye-opening and very formative for me, and it was an important moment. Poetry's taught me a hell of a lot. Poetry has really shaped who I am. Duffy combines the listing of literary techniques with explicit metaphors connoting different sexual acts, thus combining Shakespeare's love of writing and his art with their relationship. It is almost as though the two people, Shakespeare and Anne, become one. It is clear they share a level of intimacy that they won't have with anyone else, and it feels natural to them. My body now a softer rhyme to his, now echo, assonance. The use of enchantment portrays the excitement of the narrator and the thrill she felt with her husband. Furthermore, she goes on to describe his touch as a verb dancing in the centre of a noun. The dynamic verb dancing arguably can be seen to connote her passion. Alternatively, as a result of our post-feminist society being a lot more open to explicit sexual references, it could just be a euphemism hinting at the details of their sexual relationship. A notable similarity between Duffy and Nichols is the explicitness of their sexual references. However, the key difference is the emotions behind this. Duffy focuses mostly on love and the passion created from a deep emotional bond with someone, while for Nichols it seems fairly superficial, simply based around physical desire. This would have been really interesting to go into and talk about in more detail, because I'd like to discuss how neither one of these is better than the other. They're just different experiences. Both are very valid. Both are an important part of the female sexual experience. You can be both these women at once, wanting an emotional connection and the passion and the love that comes with that, and also just wanting purely physical excitement and passion. You can be a woman who wants both of those things at different times, at the same time, with different people, at different stages in your life. It's okay to be more of one than the other, or all of one and none of the other, or whatever. I wish I discussed a little bit more how there's no right or wrong kind of woman to be, but I don't know, I think, because I worry that by calling it fairly superficial, that connotes that it's a bad thing, and I did not mean to imply that at all. So it's interesting. In contrast, Duffy's poem Pygmalion's Bride, again, I haven't pronounced that right, I've only ever seen it read and not written down, sorry. But Pygmalion's Bride shows a woman oppressed by a man, and as a result, rather than embracing her sexuality as in Nichols's poems, or being rejected by the man as in White Like Us Sea, the female persona in this poem rejects the man's advances and neglects his desires. She doesn't celebrate her sexuality, but instead it is almost as though she resents it. And again, this would have been a great point to contrast with The Colour Purple, and because, again, spoilers, there is a scene of rape in that, and it would have been interesting to look at how that and the aftermath is portrayed in the book compared to her exploring her sexuality with another woman and her being far more open and accepting to that and so on. It would have been a very, very good point of comparison, I think. But what can you do? This particular poem is a retelling of the Roman myth of Pygmalion, a sculptor who created a statue who he fell in love with. After offering it gifts and praying to Venus, the god of love, she brought the statue to life. In the original tale, they end up living happily. In Duffy's version, a man obsesses over a woman trying to win her heart, even though she makes it clear she doesn't want anything to do with him. She pushes him away and ignores him. She acts like a statue. Cold I was, like snow, like ivory. Here the use of the simile, cold like ivory, has an ambiguous meaning. It could simply be interpreted as her being emotionally cold towards this man, and showing him no signs of interest. However, it could also be seen as a pun, a clever reference to the original story, where the statue would probably have been made out of ivory. Furthermore, the nouns ivory and snow create imagery of the colour white, which connotes innocence and purity, thus portraying the woman as being a victim of this man who is arguably attempting to corrupt her. The early part of this poem, in particular lines like these, could almost be interpreted as being empowering for women. Unlike women living in a pre-feminist society, today women have the right to choose what they want. Here the persona is choosing to ignore the man. She doesn't have to give in to his sexual desires and is determined not to give him what he wants or let him have her. I would not bruise. I showed no scratch, no scrape, no scar. The repetition of the sharp monosyllabic adjective no creates a tone of certainty and strength, therefore portraying the increasing strength and independence of women. However, the man is persistent, and in the end, the woman gives in to him. I changed tack, grew warm, like candle wax. It is only at this point the woman finally expresses her sexuality as she uses explicit language and sexual references. Began to moan, got hot, got wild. Duffy makes the persona into a modern woman who, unlike many characters in her literature, can differentiate between sex and her emotions. She can express her physical and sexual desires without any emotional involvement, a central part of modern society. And then we go on to the conclusion, and that's where I had to end this here, but I actually remember I had so much more to say about this, and I had to cut out a bunch of paragraphs because word count. This is not my only interpretation of this poem, because the thing is, once she gives in to him, once she has sex with him, he doesn't want her anymore. He tires of her. He essentially judges her. So it's kind of like Rochester judging Antoinette for being an overtly sexual female. It's like we see in so much modern society today, these men who slut shame women, who they want women to sleep with them, but then when they do, they don't respect them anymore. They they think it's like somehow lessens. It's quite weird, isn't it? Like, a man putting his penis in you somehow lowers your value, and the fault there is with the woman and not the penis. It makes no sense, but I would have liked to discuss that further, and especially how that's represented in this poem, and I do think I might have a video on this somewhere on my channel, and I can't remember where. But that's another interpretation. And the other one that I think would have been very interesting to look at is the fact that the woman in this poem realised that the only way she could get rid of a man was by sleeping with him and giving him what he wants. Is this coercion on the man's part, or is this a woman using her sexuality to her advantage to ultimately get what she wants? In this case, what she wants isn't necessarily sex, but to be left alone. So she uses sex as a tool rather than as an end goal. And again, this kind of brings us back to like more modern conversations and discussions and things like that. For example, and again it's controversial, but sex workers, they use sex as a tool to reach their ultimate goal of financial stability and independence. And so we have to kind of like, as feminists, ask, is that okay? If not, why not? If it is, why is it? And so on. And how much of that is women being exploited, and how much of that is women exploiting the system that's already in place for their own benefit? And I don't think there's any simple answers. I don't have any answers. I don't have fully formed conclusions about any of this. I just think it's a very interesting discussion to have, and I also think it's not always going to be the same for every woman. One woman can exploit a system for her own benefit, while another woman is being exploited by the system. It's not a one-size-fits-all. The woman in this poem, if you put two different women in this exact situation, they would react completely differently. Some might continue to be cold and ignore him and so on, and some might give in to him and do what this woman did and give him what he wants so he can move on and she can move on and whatever. Yeah, I think it would have been nice to discuss this more and talk about how feminism is very much not one size fits all, you know? We'll talk about that in a second. To conclude, all three writers portray female sexuality and desire in different ways, and it is clear that the evolution of feminism has influenced this change. As women have become more empowered and stronger, feminist literature has become more explicit in its descriptions and portrayals of sexuality, and while Rees was more open than Brontë, Nichols is clearly more expressive about the female body than Rees. Duffy, unlike Nichols, concentrates more on equality than just female empowerment. Her women express their sexuality alongside men rather than away from them. Therefore, in a modern society, it can be argued that the exploitation of women in a relationship is no longer inevitable, but instead a problem that only relatively few women have to face on a daily basis. I think this conclusion is far too simplistic and a little overly optimistic. But that might just be my cynicism and experience talking as I've got older. I think at the time when I wrote this, I was a little naive and optimistic, and I was like, yeah, feminism has succeeded in so many ways, and completely ignored the ways it had failed. But I think that's the case for a lot of people at 17, when you haven't been out there and lived in the world and had too many experiences. So I can forgive myself for that, and I can know that I've grown and changed since, which is what being a human being is all about, really. I agree with a lot of the arguments made in this essay. I do wish I'd explored certain issues further. If I was to rewrite this again today, I would have pushed the race issues a lot more and looked into them in a lot more depth, because I think that is something very, very interesting that I touched on in this, but I would love to go into way more detail. I'd also like to look at differences between same-sex couples and heterosexual couples. Like I say, using The Colour Purple would have been a great example. Talking about Caroline Duffy's work, because she is a lesbian who has had relationships with men in the past, and she was writing predominantly about heterosexual relationships in this collection. So I think looking at that and contrasting her personal experiences with her writing under these personas would have been really interesting. I also think that it would be great at this point to bring in some more contemporary poets, because even at this point, Duffy's book is 20 odd years old, so we've moved on a lot since that time. I think it would be good now to bring in more contemporary poets and also talk about, the experiences of trans women, for example, and how they are rewarded or punished for expressing their sexuality, how they still feel very constrained in a lot of places, and how they're often judged and shamed for just doing what a lot of women take for granted. But then I'd also like to touch on different cultures and how, for example, in America, female sexuality is absolutely policed a lot more than it is in the UK, but how both those countries have a lot more freedom than certain other countries, for example, certain Middle Eastern countries, where, female genital mutilation, for example, is still very, very common, and it's terrifying. So again, there are many social issues we could have brought in and looked at, and it would have been very, very interesting. And finally, the idea of coercion, sexual assault, and rape versus consensual sex would have been an interesting one to look at. And again, we could have contrasted the rape scenes in The Colour Purple with the imbalance of power and slight manipulation, and the way Duffy's character was sort of taken advantage of by an older man in Little Redcap in The World's Wife. We could have contrasted that with some of the work that focuses on more consensual relationships. I think that would have been really interesting. So, the point is, looking back, yeah, I'm actually still quite proud of this essay. I think for the time that I wrote it and the limitations I had on the work, I'm very proud of it, and I'm very happy that I wrote this. And it's also really nice to look back now and see how this really influenced my growth and my journey over the last decade, and how this was absolutely a key point in forming who I am today and setting me down this path that I've gone down, and all the things I've learned and experienced since. So it's been very, very interesting, but as I say, I think there are limitations, and I think there are more interesting discussions to be had around this topic of female sexuality and feminism in literature, and hopefully this video will be a starting point for you guys to go out there and share your own ideas and do your own research and reading and come to your own opinions and form your own ideas. Yeah, but for now, I think this is where I'm going to end this. If you're in the UK and doing your A-levels as well, I'd be really, really interested to know what you're doing for your coursework and your essays. Are you doing anything like this? Do you have the same kind of assignments these days? And if you do, let me know what you're doing, because I think that would be really interesting. And if you're anyone else, anywhere else in the world, which is probably going to be most people, then also just let me know what you thought of this, because I'm always really, really keen to hear your ideas. So with that in mind, thank you for watching today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment, because it helps with engagement and getting more people to see my videos. If you want to check out my second channel, I have an art channel where I'm doing just for fun, and it's a good giggle. And I'm going to be releasing a video this week on Thursday in which I paint with metallic watercolour paints on black paper. Quite fun. I really enjoyed making it. It was very new, it was very challenging. I had a good giggle with it, so I'm excited for you to see that. But for now, thank you for watching today. Thank you for putting up with my little stopping and starting in the middle, and hopefully I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Thank you.